Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 103, and in this lecture we're going to testify to the other ways in which the 1960s is a period of social change. We've talked about civil rights in regards to the efforts of racial minorities. We've talked about feminism. Here we'll broaden that understanding of the 60s as a time of social change, social revolution, by talking about the student protests, counterculture, and how the ways in which in the 1960s new ideas developed that offered a scathing critique of the idea that all is right in America. In those recent lectures, we've talked about the way in which the 1960s is a time of social change, civil rights, feminism, how in the 1960s many people rejected the limits and constraints of society, particularly on people who felt unfree, racial minorities, women. In our lecture on the Cold War, we talked about how the 1960s was also a period of the anti-Vietnam movement, where the American people rejected that war and the containment philosophy that undergirded that effort. So in the 40s and 50s, Americans were told all is right in America, rally around the flag, rally around institutions, America is this beacon of freedom and opportunity. But that consensus, that agreement, that idea that all is right in America did not hold in the 1960s. In the 1960s, instead, you see social movements where Americans are rising up in criticism of institutions, challenging authority, and seeking to remake America. For civil rights, it was about ending racism, discrimination, creating a more generous vision of America that included people of color. For women, it was about breaking free from the limits imposed upon their gender so that they could pursue a career and education, a life of their own making. For the anti-Vietnam movement, it was about wresting power away from institutions in government that steered America towards that ruinous war, ending that war, and the way of looking at the world that brought us into that conflict. So after World War II, in the 40s and 50s, Americans were told to enjoy the fruits of our victory, enjoy in America, an American dream restored. But by the 1960s, it was harder and harder to hold that consensus, that agreement together, owing to the social transformations of this period. And so far, we've talked about that in regards to civil rights and feminism. Here again, we'll broaden our understanding of the 60s as a time of rebellion by turning our attention to student protests, counterculture, the gay rights movement, a variety of efforts in the 1960s to challenge that idea that all is right in America. Let's begin that effort by talking about a student protest movement under the leadership of the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, which would go on to be the leading student activist organization of the 1960s, involved in civil rights protests, involved in supporting the feminist movement, gay rights movement, and very visible in the effort to end the war in Vietnam. The SDS was first formed on the campus of the University of Michigan in 1962. Over the course of the 1960s, branches of the SDS, chapters of the SDS, would be established on college campuses around the country. The manifesto, the founding document of the SDS, was the Port Huron Statement, where young people here on the campus of the University of Michigan who created this movement critiqued institutions of authority in American life, corporations, unions, the two major political parties, the military, all of which they argued pursued interests, policies so detached from the interest of the people. The name of the SDS is very revealing. They called themselves the Students for a Democratic Society. What they were arguing was America isn't a democratic society. We need to work towards a democratic society. What they argued was we have a nation ruled by a small cadre of elites in our institutions, the wealthy, the powerful, the influential, and they pursue policies that benefit them at the expense of the people. The SDS wanted to build a democratic society where everyone had a voice, a participatory democracy, where everyone could vote, everyone could influence public policy. That would make America a more democratic society. It It was 1962 when the SDS was formed. It was the height of the Cold War, where America claimed to be this beacon of democracy. We were sending young people around the globe as Peace Corps volunteers and young people around the globe as soldiers in that argument, in that effort that America was this beacon of democracy. But the SDS turned the mirror, the lens back on the American nation and said, we're not a democracy. So many of our own citizens can't vote. Before the Voting Rights Act was passed, so many of our own citizens fear for their lives in a time of racialized violence. What we need to do is create a revolution in this country that restores power to the people, a participatory democracy, and then and only then can we claim to be this beacon of democracy around the globe. So the SDS, as its name indicates, wanted to remake America in a way that would invert the power structure away from elites who pursue policies that the SDS argue are against the interest of the many, and instead concentrate power in the many, create this bottom-up revolution, create a truly democratic society that responds to the many. The SDS, like so many in the anti-war movement, argued that the American war in Vietnam is not itself the problem, though they wanted to end that war and saw the war as problematic. They instead argued that the American war in Vietnam is the symptom of a larger problem, the problem of a lack of democracy. They argued that if we truly had a nation where everyone could vote, where everyone's voice was heard, where every American citizen could participate, we would have never had a war in Vietnam. A war in Vietnam that benefited the few, corporations who manufactured napalm, the military who could aggrandize their power and get more and more funding, politicians who could use the American war in Vietnam to concentrate their power. A few, those elites, benefit, but who's dying in Southeast Asia? Poor African American, working class Americans. It's a cliche, it's a laugh line, it's a way of distilling down the 60s for commercials and advertising. You've likely heard this phrase, power to the people. And though it stands today as a cliche, a dismissive laugh line, for the SDS, it was their abiding goal, power to the people, because they believe people don't have power. They believed that far too many Americans are cut off from opportunities to participate in institutions of power. To remedy that, they sought a bottom-up revolution, and that's why they marched with Dr. King, seeing a connection between their own cause and the cause of civil rights. That's why they marched with Betty Friedan, and now and the modern feminists of this period, seeing a connection between their movement and the efforts of American women who wanted to be free and equal members of society. That's why they advocated for anti-poverty efforts. That's why they served in VISTA, a sort of domestic peace corps that sought to ameliorate poverty and a lack of educational opportunities within the United States. And that's why they march in those ever-swelling, ever-growing anti-Vietnam protests, seeing the American war in Vietnam as, again, further evidence that we don't have a democracy, that a small cadre of elites rule this nation and steer public policy towards things like the ruinous war in Vietnam because it benefits those elites, but does so at the expense of the many. So the SDS, formed in 1962, new chapters, new branches, created on college campus around the nation. They are very prominent here in California on UC and CSU campuses. They had this vision of remaking America, challenging America, advertising in many ways its false image as a beacon of democracy, and working towards that through this bottom-up revolution that would restore power to the many, wrest power away from the few. They marched with Dr. King. They were active in the gay rights movement, feminist movements of this period. They sought an end to the war in Vietnam as part of this broad vision of a more democratic America. The effort of the SDS was focused on political reform. They wanted to change laws. They wanted to empower people to vote. But from that comes a crusade, a quest for cultural transformation. Using this term in this lecture, the counterculture, and it's a very revealing term. Counterculture means a group of Americans here who are challenging the mainstream and seeking different ways of being in the world. Counterculture was a way of describing certainly the SDS and the other student activism of this period, but the counterculture was also a more broad-based effort centering on personal liberation that branched beyond politics towards cultural change. It came out of that idea that institutions of authority are corrupt or geared towards narrow ends. Don't trust the government, but don't trust your TV or Hollywood either. The counterculture was a quest, an effort that sought to create new ways of being, recognize a variety of different pursuits, a more free and open society. And as a result, it questioned institutions of power. It questioned figures of authority. It argued that we're not all destined to live in the same way. We're not all destined to get married, move off to the suburbs, and spend our lives staring at the TV. From this came new attitudes about daily life, reassessments of the rules as part of this counterculture. People dressed different. They spoke different. Big part of the 1960s, in addition to civil rights, feminism, gay rights, counterculture, was the sexual revolution. New attitudes about sexuality. 1960s, finally, birth control was decriminalized in a landmark Supreme Court decision. By the early 70s, abortion was now available in all 50 states. By the early 70s, blue laws that restricted access to pornography were overturned. More libertine values prevailed about sexuality. A rejection of the world your parents had made that confined sexuality to the nuclear family ideal. People experimented with drugs in the 1960s in an effort to not only break the law, break the rules, but also get in greater touch with their own personal sensibilities. Overall, the counterculture, this cultural movement beyond the political efforts of the 60s, sought to create different ways of being in the world, to reject the very conformist and stifling vision that we're all expected to get married, move off to the suburbs, and stare at the TV. That's why people experimented with different forms of dress, different forms of speech, slang. People dressed casually, dressing in blue jeans, which became common in the 60s for the first time. And people often lived in very different unorthodox ways. Communes were part of American life in the 60s, where people rejected mainstream life, were convinced that institutions, corporations polluted the environment and polluted the soul. They wanted to live simply, off the land. There was a back to land movement in the 60s, where people went and lived communally on farms, hoping to share and live as equals. So it was a time where so many were convinced that American life was empty, plastic, inauthentic, and they sought something more meaningful. They didn't want to climb the corporate ladder. They didn't see owning a new car and being saddled with payments, a mortgage, as a sign of success, but a sign of servitude. And they wanted to break free from that. One good example of a countercultural figure, Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary was a professor at Harvard University in the 1960s. And he pioneered studies in the use of LSD, and ultimately, after he was fired from Harvard University, became a strong advocate in American life for Americans using LSD. He told Americans to take a little trip, drop some acid. Not just because it might be pleasurable to experiment with drugs, not only because it was part of the loosening of mores, but Leary argued that by the time you are an adult, after 18 years on this planet, in this country, you have been effectively denied your true self. You've been told what God to worship, what flag to salute, what rules to follow. Leary said, the great fiction, the great falsehood of life is that we tell ourselves that when we're 18, we're free, we're independent, we're adults, we can make our own life. But actually, by the time we turn 18, we have been told what to do. We have been ultimately pre-programmed by society to be anything but free and independent. His great cause was to get in touch with one's true self, to jettison, remove all of those messages that have saturated your mind since your birth. He said, so many of us live lives that aren't of our own making. So many of us live lives where we are detached from our true selves. What you need to do is free your mind. Remove those messages. And for him, the only way to do that was to take LSD. So we're talking about a Harvard professor here. We're not talking about some crackpot out of the back of a van in the parking lot of Cerritos College. We're talking about a man who argued as a professor at Harvard that all Americans should take LSD in order to know their true selves. Another example of the counterculture, the Yippies, founded by, among others, Abbie Hoffman. The Yippies were the original flash mob. They would go to public places, put on events, all of which were designed to startle you, wake up your consciousness, and most importantly, see the nonsense that we accept. See the nonsense that we all abide by and don't question. The Yippies, led by Abbie Hoffman, emphasized theoreticality in these performances, where they would go places and put on performances that again were designed to shock you, to jar you, and urge you to see things in a different way. For example, they went to the New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street. You've probably seen this on television. This pit of stockbrokers who are there on the floor, yelling at each other, wheeling and dealing, literally exchanging billions of dollars across the global economy. The Yippies went to the New York Stock Exchange, the heart of the American economy, the heart of American capitalism. And there on the floor were these stockbrokers, wheeling and dealing, yelling into their phones, or at that case, probably just yelling at each other. Young men, and they were almost all men in the 1960s, who made hundreds of thousands of dollars then in the 1960s and were responsible for billions of dollars. The Yippies went there and they took out a fistful of $1 bills and they threw them up in the air so that the $1 bills would float down to these stockbrokers. And what do these stockbrokers do? These young men who were wealthy, who are in charge of a global economy of billions of dollars, they stop what they're doing, stop trading on the floor of Wall Street, and they start grabbing at these $1 bills, fighting with each other. Who's going to grab the $1 bill? They start fighting over $1 bills. This was designed to demonstrate the absurdity of everything, the absurdity of life. These very wealthy people fighting over a dollar. The Yippies wanted to expose how so much of what we take for granted in everyday life is ultimately nonsense. What they wanted to do was shake you up, jar you, and urge you to realize that most of what we deal with on a daily basis, the way the world works, is bullshit. And once you see it as bullshit, you'll stop eating it. You'll stop accepting it. You'll break free from a modern life that seems to be predicated on nonsense and carve out for yourself something real and meaningful. Countercultural movements in the 60s penetrate American life. They permeate our society. You could see them in popular culture. Music changes in the 60s. It gets more political. Folk music. Many soul singers spoke about the condition of being poor and black in urban America. A lot of singing represented the burgeoning environmentalist movement. 1960s was a time of civil rights, feminism, the counterculture, the anti-Vietnam movement, and the origins of the modern environmentalist movement. And a lot of music in the 60s was designed to awaken America's sensibilities about pollution, the wasteful lives we lived. Bob Dylan, in what will really stand as the anthem of the 1960s, "The Times They Are A-Changing," spoke to a generational divide between the parents of the 1950s and the children that they brought into America in the baby boom era. He sang in that song, "The times they are a-changing, your sons and daughters are beyond your command. They're seeking new ways of thinking, new ways of being, challenging the world their parents made." So you could see the counterculture's impact on popular culture, popular song, and in movies. In 1964, you have a film called Dr. Strangelove, subtitled "Or How I Stopped Worrying and Came to Love the Bomb," which was the scathing satire of the Cold War, making fun of institutions of authority that were designed to protect us: the president, the military, the State Department. They're revealed to be buffoons that we've trusted with nuclear weapons. So Dr. Strangelove is a good example of how in the early 60s, in 64, there were already these scathing critiques of institutions of authority. One of the popular plays performed on college campuses in the 1960s was Edward Albee's Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? This was turned into a film in 1966 starring Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. And it's a good example of how the counterculture critiqued figures of authority, institutions of authority, the adults in your life. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf centers on figures of authority that you should respect, admire, look to as guardians of success, guardians of development. That's right, college professors. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is about college professors, people who are, again, figures of authority, gatekeepers, guardians of truth and knowledge. But the college professors in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf are not people to admire or emulate. They're represented as drunks, alcoholics, drug addicts, pathetic anti-heroes. The message of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is don't be like your professors. Don't be like the adults in your life. They live miserable lives, empty lives. Break free from those figures of authority and carve out something real and genuine. 1930s, in the Great Depression, the major Hollywood studios got together and they established the Production Code, which would establish a series of rules, strictures, regulations that limited what could be shown in American movies. This was a response to the Great Depression, the great moral concern of that period, which we talked about, where many Americans were convinced that we had lost our way, that there was a great moral crisis that had led to the Great Depression, and we wanted to clean up movies in an effort to clean up America, make better movies, make a better nation. So in the 30s, amidst the Great Depression, the Production Code was first established, and it prevailed into the late 1960s. For more than 30 years, most, if not all, American films produced in that period were subject to this form of regulation. It wasn't government regulation, but it was a joint agreement among the studios. That's why when you see movies from that period, the bad guy and a crime caper is always caught, because one of the rules of the Production Code was you could not show crime paying or profiting. But by the early 60s, Hollywood studios were losing money. They're losing money, one, because of television, offering you visual entertainment in your home, but also because the films made by the studio, still adhering to the code, did not fit with the more critical sensibilities of young people who were the audience for films. By the early 60s, the audience for Hollywood movies, young people. Older people stayed home and watched TV. It was young people who went to the movies, but they didn't see in the films of that period anything that really connected and resonated with them. And so, with audience attendance diminishing, Hollywood studios abandoned the Production Code. And so in the late 60s, film becomes much more edgier, countercultural, because now Hollywood studios can make movies that do not have to follow the code. Movies with nudity, violence, drug use, films that deal with adult themes and concerns, racism, domestic violence. And so that explains the origins of the new Hollywood of the late 60s and 1970s, when films are much more raw and connected with the countercultural sensibilities of America in that period. And a key moment in that is 1967, when two films were nominated for Best Picture, two films that were produced after the code expired, two films that really connect with young people of that period. One was Bonnie and Clyde. a film starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway that examines the Depression-era gangsters Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker. It's a film that's an ode to rebellion, going your own way, living a life of your own terms. Early in the film, Clyde Barrow pulls up next to a farmhouse. The young Bonnie Parker is outside hanging laundry, doing her domestic duty as a wife. He opens the door of his car, says, "Hey, hop in." She looks at him, shrugs her shoulders, and says, "Why not?" And they're off for a wild ride as they rise to infamy as bank robbers, living a life of their own making. Final scene of that film is one of the most violent scenes in Hollywood history, certainly one you could not film in the production era, where the two are gunned down in a blaze of bullets. And in that, they died as they lived, in a burst of glory. Also in 1967, nominated for Best Picture, The Graduate, starring a then unknown actor, Dustin Hoffman. This film, surprisingly, based on the title, is about a college graduate, Benjamin, played by Dustin Hoffman, who's just graduated from a prestigious university, and he goes back home to his home in sunny Santa Barbara. And wherever he goes as a recent graduate, every adult in his life asks him the same question. "All right, Ben, you've graduated. What next? Are you going to go to law school? Going to go to grad school? Going to get married? Going to get a job at your father's firm?" Well, Benjamin doesn't know the answer to that question, what's next, but he knows that all of those possibilities mapped out for him. Go to law school, go to grad school, get married. He doesn't want any part of. And so he's adrift, sometimes literally, floating in the pool, trying to figure out his next way forward, but resolute that he doesn't want to live as his parents have. During this time, he becomes involved in an affair with the wife of his dad's business partner, Mrs. Robinson. If you've heard the song, the Simon and Garfunkel song, that song was written for this film, and Paul Simon appears in the movie itself. Played by Anne Bancroft, Mrs. Robinson becomes Benjamin's lover, but through the course of their affair, Benjamin falls in love with her daughter, Elaine, and that proves to be his true love. So he wants to break away from Mrs. Robinson and their affair and be with Elaine, but he knows that if he breaks off the affair, the mother, Mrs. Robinson, will expose the affair, and Elaine will find him repulsive. "You had sex with my mom?" Well, he breaks off the affair. Mrs. Robinson does indeed expose the affair, and Elaine, thus disgusted, decides to reject Benjamin and marry the young man her parents have selected for her, a young man who will give her that life in the suburbs and 2.3 children, that American dream. And then you get to the final scene, one of the most famous scenes in Hollywood history, where Benjamin is frantically driving his little sports car to the church to stop the wedding. He runs out of gas, and so he runs on foot, and he makes his way to the church, and he gets there, and he pounds on the glass, the window, and he says, "Elaine, Elaine, Elaine, Elaine." Elaine looks at him, looks at the groom-to-be that she's about to marry, and she yells, "Ben!" and runs to him, running away from the altar, running away from that conformist lifestyle. She runs from the church. Her mom, Mrs. Robinson, grabs her and says, "It's too late." And then Elaine says, "Not for me." And that's the message of that film, and that's its countercultural sensibility. You sold out. You gave up your freedom. You gave up your individuality. But for us, the young people, it's not too late to create a world of our own. Ben and Elaine hop in a bus, ride away to the sounds of that Simon and Garfunkel hit, The Sounds of Silence, and that's how the film ends. Quizzical, unclear. We don't know what happens to Ben and Elaine. We never see that part of the story, but we know that whatever happens to Ben and Elaine, it's of their own making and own choosing. So the counterculture became so powerful, this emphasis on freedom, liberation, breaking free from figures of authority, carving out your own life, that it permeated so much of American life, our pop culture, our film, our music in this period. Let's conclude our look at the counterculture with more evidence of the 1960s as a time of challenging authority and new attitudes and new ideas. Not only was the 1960s a time of civil rights and feminism and the counterculture and the anti-Vietnam movement, it was also a time of the modern gay rights movement. After World War II, in the 1940s and 1950s, during the Red Scare, that effort by Joseph McCarthy to insinuate that so many Americans were un-American, secret communist sympathizers, there was a very deliberate effort as part of that to associate homosexuality with communism, arguing that every gay and lesbian was really a commie and every commie was gay and lesbian. This was an effort by McCarthy and others to represent both communism and sexual minorities as threats to America, threats to the American way, threats to the American family. So in the late 40s, early 50s, gay and lesbians who had sacrificed and served in World War II came home to an America where they were being deliberately associated with un-American values, threats to America. Gays and lesbians in the 50s were also subject to discrimination, violence, selective persecution of law. They were harassed by police. They were subject to very selective enforcement of sodomy laws. Sodomy laws were laws that criminalized certain sexual acts that heterosexuals engaged in, but it was only gays and lesbians who were ever charged, a way in which they were unequal in society. Despite this, as early as the 1950s, there were advocacy groups, civil rights groups among gays and lesbians. An early example of this, the Machine Society, which was founded in 1951. These were very brave Americans, many of whom were veterans of the war, either World War II or then Korea, who had sacrificed and served for this nation, and they would march in American cities with signs that said, "I'm a gay American," coming out of the closet without fear, without compunction, brave, and say, "I'm an American too. I deserve to be a free and equal member of this nation," during a time in which, again, gays and lesbians were subject to harassment, police brutality, selective enforcement of laws that criminalized only them, and also a deliberate effort to associate them with being enemies of America. And then here comes the 60s, civil rights, feminism, and from that came the modern gay rights movement. And the event most important associated with that gay rights movement, Stonewall Rebellion, which occurred in the summer of 1969. Stonewall Inn was well known to be a gay bar where men went to dance and drink together to be free members in a free society. But because of that, it was routinely raided by the New York Police Department. New York Police Department would come in, arrest men for dancing and drinking together in public. The police department would come in and beat the patrons of this bar, crack skulls. So Stonewall Inn, still there today, by the way, still in operation. In fact, one of the very last things that President Obama did before he left office was declare the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village in New York City the first LGBTQ National Historic Landmark. So it's still there. But in the 60s, it became the site of this flashpoint event, the catalyst to the modern gay rights movement. Because one day in the summer of 1969, when the cops went in to do what they routinely did, break skulls, harass the patrons had enough. They were tired of this maltreatment, and they fought back. They beat the hell out of the cops, and the cops had to go running out of the bar. And then the cops, angry, called for reinforcement. And then people in the neighborhood who weren't necessarily gay or lesbian themselves, but were sympathetic to these people who just want to be left alone, came out and supported those patrons who, again, just wanted to be free and equal citizens in a free society. For 5 days, that neighborhood in New York City was awash in riots, clashes between the cops and patrons of the bar and those sympathetic to their cause of freedom. This riveted the attention of the American public. It challenged stereotypes about gay men as weak and effeminate. Here were gay men beating the hell out of New York Police Department officers. And it gave birth to the modern gay rights movement. In the 1970s, you have the first gay pride parades. You have increasingly gay and lesbian Americans coming out of the closet without shame, without compunction, proud of who they are, and demanding that they be full and equal members of the American nation. In the 1970s, the American Psychiatric Association, the APA, finally removed homosexuality from its list of mental disorders. Believe it or not, well into the 1970s, the American Psychiatric Association, the professional society representing psychiatrists in America, listed homosexuality is a mental disorder. Thankfully, in the 70s, with the efforts of the gay pride and gay rights movement that ended, Harvey Milk was elected to the San Francisco City Council, the first openly gay politician to be elected to such a high office in a large American city. But also in the 1970s, there was a backlash to gay rights. Anita Bryant, a former Miss America and orange juice spokeswoman, and born-again Christian, came out against gay rights and lent her support to a number of initiatives around the country that would limit gay rights, including the Briggs Initiative. The Briggs Initiative was an initiative on the California state ballot in 1978 that would prohibit gay and lesbians from working as teachers in the state of California. Now, it doesn't pass, but millions of Californians supported it. And Anita Bryant comes out here trying to build support for it. So the 1970s would see the birth of the gay rights movement. It would see gay pride events. It would see a number of steps forward in the cause of equality and opportunity. But there's a backlash to that because, as we'll talk about in many lectures to come, 1970s was also a very conservative period with the rise of the conservative movement, the rise of cultural conservatives in particular, evangelicals, born-again Christians, televangelists like Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, Anita Bryant, the Briggs Initiative. It's another period of contest, argument, in this case about the place of sexual minorities in American society. Nevertheless, gays and lesbians pursue equality, opportunity. From this would come the effort to allow gays and lesbians to adopt, to marry, the marriage rights movements that we've seen in the last decade. So 1960s was a time of remarkable transformations. We broadened that here in this lecture, talking about the counterculture, the SDS, the changes broadly in American society, sensibilities, and now finally the modern gay rights movement, which is this effort by other Americans, in this case sexual minorities, gays and lesbians, who want opportunity, who change attitudes about what does it mean to be an American, what is the American family. You know, we have the show that's wrapping up now, Modern Family, very aptly titled sitcom here in the now 21st century, where we accept, embrace, enjoy the idea that there are many different ways of being a modern American family. There's the nuclear family ideal of Phil Dunphy and his wife Claire, but there are blended families, divorced people who remarry. There are same-sex couples raising children. From the efforts of the counterculture, from the efforts of the gay rights movement, has come a more free society where we recognize that there are indeed many different ways of being in the world.